Hello, and welcome to Business Law Week 15. We're almost to the end. This week we're going to look at some brand new topic we've really not touched on before, and that's negotiable instruments. Well, a negotiable instrument is something we'll look at the definition of in a little bit. Before we get into that, though, I'll just make the point I think this is something that's kind of important. If you're running a business, handling money and funds and things, odds are you're going to deal with a negotiable instrument pretty often. And so I think it's important to know a little bit of something about it. Not going to make you an expert. Certainly, I'm not an expert as much as a lot of people are who practice in this area of law all the time. But I think it's something that it's really good to kind of understand the outlines of how the law works because it's frankly a little bit weird. Negotiable instruments are governed by the UCC, Articles 3 and 4. Article 3 deals specifically with negotiable instruments. Article 4 deals mostly with checks and things like that, and even electronic fund transfers and that sort of stuff. This topic is not liked by a lot of people who study it. In law school, it kind of made our heads spin a little bit. Because there's not there's that much to remember about it so much, but it's just a little weird and counterintuitive. It kind of goes against our assumptions a little bit. I think you'll see what I mean as we go through this. So we're not going to do any kind of in-depth analysis. You're not going to know all the ins and outs of this, but I just wanted to familiarize you with the concepts, and so please stick with me. Part of it's a little bit strange and be like, what? The law really says that, but it does. And so I think you'll understand as we go along. Well, what in the world is a negotiable instrument? Well, going back to the beginning of history, there was money, and it was good. Money can pay for things. Money can buy stuff. But before too long, after someone invented money, it became obvious that paying cash for everything wasn't that great an idea because sometimes it would take a whole lot of cash to pay for something that's really expensive. For example, imagine you went to buy a $150,000 house and no one had invented a way to pay for things except by using cash. And so at the real estate closing, you would need a wheelbarrow, maybe several of them, and armed guards. And you would have to carry this cash around and flop it up on the closing table, $150,000 in cash. No one wants to carry that around. You could lose it. Bad things can happen. And there just needs to be other ways to pay for things. And there can be other ways that are more convenient to transfer money from one person to another than using cash. And so eventually, people came up with methods of extending credit and transferring money that are almost as good as cash. People will trust those, not as much as cash, but they'll find them trustworthy. They'll accept them in payment. But these methods are a lot more convenient than carrying around your wheelbarrow full of cash. We can have checks and other kinds of notes and things. And so people came up with alternatives to cash. And a main alternative to cash, a cash substitute, if you will, are called negotiable instruments, and that's what we're going to be looking at. At its core, a negotiable instrument is just really a special kind of contract. It is a contract, and some contract principles apply to it just like any other contract, but it also has some special characteristics that the law treats in a special way that other contracts don't get. And so we will look at what those are in a little bit. But first off, a negotiable instrument, to be classified as such, has to meet some specific qualifications. And we will look at what these actually mean in some detail, but here's the outline of all of them. It has to be an unconditional promise or order to pay, a fixed amount of money, which is also called a sum certain in the legal literature, made payable to order or to bearer, on demand or at a definite time, that is made in writing, and signed by the maker or drawer. Well, at this point, you're like, okay, that's a lot of stuff. What does it all mean? We'll look at it all. It's not as weird as it sounds, though, because if you've ever written a check, you have used a negotiable instrument and has met all of these requirements. And so it's not that uncommon at all. It's very common in business to have some kind of negotiable instrument. And so we'll look at what all these different characteristics actually mean. The first one is that it has to be unconditional. What that means is that there are no strings attached to the instrument. For example, if you say, I promise to pay Jack $100, but only if the Cubs win the World Series, well, that's a conditional promise. There's no actual certainty that you're ever going to pay because the Cubs have been since 1908 as of I'm making this presentation, and they have not yet won the World Series. And so you could be waiting a very, very long time, and you might never get your money. So if you will only pay Jack if something happens, that's And that's not unconditional. That is conditional. That has a string attached. And so we don't want any strings attached if we're going to have a negotiable instrument. It just can't have one of those conditions. It has to be an unconditional promise to pay. We're going to pay no matter what. There's no strings attached, nothing that has to happen before it becomes due and payable. It has to be a promise or order. And by that, we mean it either has to contain a promise to pay on the part of the person making it to pay a certain amount of money, or has to be an order to a third person to pay that amount of money. So the person making this instrument may be promising that I'm going to pay you myself, or it has to be an order to a third party. Hey, bank that I have an account in, pay this person. So it has to be one of those two things. And so that's really what separates an instrument from just an IOU. An IOU is an acknowledgement of a debt, is what the legal ease says about that. But it's not necessarily a promise to pay the money back. I owe you 20 bucks, and you write that on a piece of paper or a napkin or something. Okay, that's great, but that's not a negotiable instrument. It doesn't satisfy the promise or order to pay. It has to be more definite than that and legally enforceable. So, to be a negotiable instrument, it must contain an actual promise or order to actually pay money that will end up holding up in court if we get to that point. We also have to have a sum certain, and so a specific amount of money that we're talking about. It can't be kind of up in the air. I promise to pay Mary a lot of money is not a sum certain. So if we can't tell the dollar figure on the face of the instrument, it is likely not a sum certain that will hold up as a negotiable instrument. Also, it has to be money. I promise to give Allison 13 turkeys. Does not count as a sum certain. I guess the base reason for that, we don't know what 13 turkeys is going to be worth. We don't know what the going rate for turkeys is on that particular day. So it has to be a specific amount of money, not goods, not something else like that. It has to be payable to order or to bearer. To order means that an instrument is made out to a specific person. So I promise to pay Susie is a promise to pay to the order of Susie. So you will give Susie the money, or someone that Susie tells you to pay instead of her or whatever, but she gets to order you around how you hand over the money, basically. So it's to order. To bearer means that the instrument is payable to anyone who is holding the instrument. And so just by virtue of the fact that you have possession of the instrument means that you have a right to get paid. That sounds a little funny, but that happens quite a bit, actually. If you have a check made out to you and you endorse the check just by signing your name, that becomes a bearer instrument. As soon as you've endorsed it, then whoever has possession of it can cash it legally. If they steal it from you, of course, that's a different problem. But in terms of negotiation and all those processes we'll look at in a little bit, it can be negotiated to whoever has it. So that's a little tip here I'll throw in for free as we're going along. It's a really good idea to write for deposit only when you endorse a check, because that way someone can't find it if you lose it and go cash it. Because even though the check was originally payable to the order of you, once you endorse it, you magically turn it into a bearer instrument. And so that can happen sometimes. Another way to create a bearer instrument is to make a check out to cash. I don't know if you've ever done that or not with ATMs these days, and the need for that isn't nearly as great, but I remember when I was a kid, Mom would take me into town to go shopping, and we'd stop by the bank and she'd write a check made out to cash and give it to the teller and get, a wad of cash out of the bank, and then we could go shopping. If you have one of those checks made out to cash, anyone who has physical possession of that check can then cash it. It becomes a bearer instrument. But anyway, however it works, it either has to be payable to order or to bearer in order to be a negotiable instrument. Another requirement for a negotiable instrument is that it has to be payable on demand or at a definite time. So I promise to pay Mary someday or when I feel like it is not definite and certain. So it has to be some kind of definite time, not when I feel like it. So a negotiable instrument can be made payable at a specific time, April 30, 2011, for instance, or when the person it is made out to demands payment. So whenever that person presents it, they get to get paid. So it could be either way. If you write a check, you can go present that check to the bank for payment. And when you present it, you're demanding payment. And so if it works that way, if you can get paid on demand, or if it makes a specific date in there, like for instance, if you do a note, when you buy a house, it'll say, you have to pay them, your mortgage payments every month or whatever. It'll have a specific date, or it could just be demand. Normally when you write a check, that's just on demand. Whenever the person you give the check to shows it to the bank, they are demanding payment and they can get paid. So one of those two things, but it can't be, I will pay you maybe, if I decide to, when I feel like it, if I have to, I guess. That's not going to be good enough. It also has to be in writing. You cannot have an oral negotiable instrument. It can be handwritten, typed, on a pre-printed form, or whatever, but in some form or another, it has to be in writing. It also has to be signed by the person making it. So it can be the person's full name, it can be some symbol if you're like the singer Prince or whatever, it can be initials, if you're illiterate it can be an X, whatever, as long as it indicates the maker's intent to authenticate the instrument, and that's the key thing. But it does have to be signed by the person who is making it, who's going to be on the hook financially for this. So it has to be in writing and it has to be signed. So if we have all those elements met, then we end up having a negotiable instrument. Negotiable instrument is just, like we said, a special kind of contract. But if we meet these special requirements that we talked about, it qualifies as a negotiable instrument, and special rules will apply. If one of those elements is missing, we may still have a binding contract, entirely possible. However, the special rules we're going to look at regarding negotiable instruments won't apply to it, and if that's the case, we would just look to the common law of contracts to sort things out. So it doesn't mean that we don't have a contract necessarily, that you couldn't take someone to court and enforce it. It just means that the special rules that govern negotiable instruments won't apply to it. Let's look now at the different types of negotiable instruments. We have really two parts to the world of negotiable instruments. We have promises to pay and we have orders to pay. The most common type of promise to pay is what we call a promissory note, or just a note for short. This is what you sign when you take out a loan for your house. There are really two important documents going on there. There's the mortgage, which creates a security interest in the house, so if you stop paying, they can come take your house. But you also sign a promissory note, which makes you personally liable on the debt. And we looked and saw what that meant earlier, but basically if the bank forecloses on your house and takes the house, but the foreclosure sale doesn't bring enough money in to pay off your debt, then the bank can sue you on the note for the difference. And so they can go after your bank account or your car or your boat or whatever to try to satisfy the difference. And so you become personally liable on that note when you sign it. Another common type of promise to pay is a certificate of deposit. What happens there is you deposit money in the bank, and then at a specific point in the future, the bank promises to return your money and to pay a certain amount of interest on top of that. So you're letting the bank borrow your money, basically, at a specific interest rate, but when they give you that certificate of deposit, that's their promise to pay you back. So they'll take your money for a while, but then they will give it back, plus a little bit more for the privilege of having borrowed your money. When you're talking about a note, a promissory note, the person who signs that note is known as the maker. And so that's the person who is promising to pay the money. The person who receives the money is called the payee. So another nice E word that the legal jargon loves to use. Negotiable instruments try to accomplish two different goals. One is that it can be used as a money substitute. So rather than taking our wheelbarrows full of cash around, we will give you a note. The other purpose it serves is to create a means of extending credit to somebody. So a note really does the second goal pretty well. A bank is unwilling to loan out money unless there is a legal means of forcing you to pay it back. A promissory note is a vehicle they use to do that. And so the bank will give you some money, but they will force you to sign a note. And so if you fail to pay that money back, they can go sue you on the note and, garnish your wages or take your car or your house or, your bank account or whatever the case may be. So a negotiable or a note will take, it can be used as a money substitute, really, when you're buying your house, you're not taking your wheelbarrow full of cash in, but it's also a means of extending credit to people. And this is the mechanism we use to make sure they will pay us back if we loan the money. And so really we couldn't loan out the money if we didn't have some means of reassuring ourselves that they would pay us back. So the promissory note does that. Another second major type of negotiable instrument is the order to pay. And these fulfill the money substitute function of negotiable instruments pretty well. An order from one party to another party to pay a certain amount of money is what we call a draft. And for example, let's say that Chuck is a plumber and works on Steve's house. Steve owes Chuck $500 for the work which he is supposed to pay on May the 1st. Before Steve pays Chuck, Chuck's car breaks down. He has a mechanic, Joe, work on his car. The bill comes to exactly $500. Chuck is short on cash, and so he gives Joe a piece of paper that says, Steve, I order you to pay the $500 you owe me to Joe on May 1st. Joe takes the paper to Steve, and Steve pays the money to Joe. Now, Joe is happy because he got paid, and Steve no longer owes Chuck anything. And so, an admittedly silly example, but this is how a draft would work. It's an order to pay somebody else. So, if somebody owes you money, you order them to pay a third party. And so that's how a draft works in its basic form. As you might imagine, the example we just looked at would probably never happen in the real world. No one would take a handwritten draft on an envelope or something in payment probably, but it's a simple way of seeing how the process works. Chuck didn't have the cash to pay Joe, but somebody else did have some money that was rightfully Chuck's. And so Chuck could use an order to pay that money. In this case, it was a draft as a cash substitute. And so he can pay off his bill just by presenting an order to pay money. So in this example, we would call Chuck the drawer. And you have to be careful here. This word is not pronounced like the place you store your socks. It's like what you would call a person who draws pictures, a drawer. So if you see this word, don't think drawer, think drawer in the context of negotiable instruments. So Steve, who actually has Chuck's money, is called the drawee. The drawer creates the order to pay, which is directed to the drawee, who is supposed to actually pay the money to somebody else. And that somebody else is Joe, in this case, who was the payee. And so we have the drawer who writes the order, the drawee who receives the order, and the payee who actually receives the money. And so it's kind of a three-person transaction here. A special kind of draft that we're probably pretty familiar with is called a check. A check is a type of draft that is payable on demand and, second, is drawn on a bank. So in other words, the bank is the drawee rather than, Chuck and Steve and Joe and whatever. We're talking about the Bank of Neosho or something here. So it's payable on demand and it's drawn on a bank. And so that if those two things are met, then our draft is a special kind of draft called a check, which we're probably fairly familiar with dealing with at some point in our history. So, for example, Sylvia goes to Marge's garage sale, wants to buy a sewing machine. Sylvia doesn't have a lot of cash, so she asks Marge to take a check. Sylvia writes a check ordering Great Western Bank to pay $100 she has on deposit there to Marge. Marge takes the check and presents it to Great Western Bank, demanding payment. Great Western gives Marge $100 and deducts that amount from Sylvia's account. So this beautiful thing we see happening here, we have a cash substitute where we didn't have the cash on hand. We were able to use this special draft in order to pay for our garage sale sewing machine. And so that's how the transaction can work. And here Sylvia is the drawer and the bank is the drawee. Marge is the payee. And so a very simple example of Sylvia successfully using a negotiable instrument as a cash substitute. Let's talk now about a process that we call negotiation. And this is kind of what makes the negotiable instrument special in the first place. Remember how with regular contracts we said that you could assign contract rights and delegate duties to third parties? You may remember that. In certain situations anyway, rather than fulfill the contract duties ourselves, we could delegate those duties. If we didn't really want the benefit of the contract anymore for some reason, we could assign those contract rights to a third party, and the law lets us do that in many cases. Well, the thing that makes a negotiable instrument very special is a set of rules that allow the rights they embody to be transferred, or we say negotiated, to other people. And so negotiation is just kind of a fancy word for transfer, really. We're able to move those contract rights around to other people. If an instrument meets the 7 requirements we looked at earlier, it is negotiable, which means it is easily transferred and some special transfer rules apply. If one of those elements is missing, then it may still be a binding contract, but it's not negotiable. And you may have actually seen sometimes I've gotten, like a thing in the mail from Publishers Clearinghouse where there's a fake check in there, and it'll say, and boldly on there somewhere, non-negotiable, like, warning, this is a fake check, you can't really cash it. And so, being negotiable means it can be transferred. We can actually use it to get money from one person to another. So if one of those 7 elements is missing, it's not negotiable. It might still be a binding contract, but these special rules we're going to look at don't necessarily apply to it. With a normal contract assignment, remember that the assignee steps into the shoes of the assignor and gets the same rights, no better, no worse. You just step right into the shoes of the person that you're replacing if the contract rights are assigned to you. What's special about negotiation and what sets negotiable instruments apart is that the person who has a negotiable instrument negotiated to them can actually get better rights than the person who was the original owner of the instrument. And that is completely counterintuitive and what is a little confusing about the whole business. So, you can actually get better rights than the person that you stepped into the shoes of. Somehow they can give you better rights than they had. And that's a little bit backwards. And so that's kind of what makes us scratch our head a little bit about this whole thing. The person to whom a negotiable instrument is transferred through negotiation becomes a holder. And we will talk about what a holder is in a little bit. But before we do that, we'll talk a little bit more about the process of negotiation. Negotiation is really just a technical term for how an instrument, and more importantly, the right to get paid that comes with that instrument, is transferred from one person to another. If we have a bearer instrument, then whoever has possession of the instrument has the rights to come with it. We saw that, that check made out to cash, or a check that you endorsed without any for deposit only or any kind of restrictive endorsement on there. When you have a bearer instrument, in order to negotiate it from one person to another, all you have to do is give it to them. So if it's a bearer instrument, it's a check made out to cash, you just hand it to somebody, and that delivery means you've negotiated that instrument to the other person, and they can take it to the bank and get it turned into cash. And so that's, with a bearer instrument, that's pretty easy. You just hand it to somebody. So for example, Rudy writes a check for $50 made out to cash. Rudy has created a bearer instrument. Rudy hands the check to Gloria. Rudy has delivered the instrument. Gloria is now the holder. So Gloria can then take the check to Rudy's bank and demand payment. And so that holder, is the person that's negotiated to. Gloria becomes the holder just by virtue of taking possession of the check. Once Rudy hands it to her and delivers it, then suddenly it's been negotiated to her, and suddenly she has the right to get payment. Now, Gloria could have, handed it off to somebody else, and then they would have the right to get paid. She would have negotiated it to them. And so sometimes the process of negotiation is really simple. You just hand it to somebody else. If it's a bearer instrument, that's all you have to do. And whoever actually holds the check at any particular moment is the holder, and the holder then has the right to get paid. So pretty simple there. The process of negotiation is just a little bit more complicated with an order instrument. It takes 2 things, not just one. To negotiate an order instrument, you have to first do the delivery, just like a bearer instrument. You actually have to hand it over to whomever you're delivering it to and negotiating it to. And second, you also have to have an endorsement, which can either be spelled with an E or an I, depending on what book you're reading. I prefer E myself, but either one means the same thing. For example, let's say Julia writes a check to Nancy for $75. It is an order instrument, of course. On the line that says, paid to the order of blank, Julia writes in Nancy. Julia then hands the check to Nancy, so delivery has occurred. Then, Nancy endorses the check by signing her name on the back. The check has then been negotiated to Nancy, who is now the holder. So Nancy can then take the check to the bank and demand payment. And so, because it's an order instrument, just handing it over to you is not enough. In order to actually negotiate it to you, you also have to have that endorsement. So if you have those 2 things happening, then you have actually negotiated that order instrument over. I'm guessing we've all at one time or another endorsed a check, which is part of that negotiation process for an order instrument. There are actually different kinds of endorsements. If you just sign your name on the back of the check, like we had in that example, that's what's called a blank endorsement. And as we've seen, that has the effect of converting the check, which was an order instrument, into a bearer instrument. And so once the person it's made to the order of endorses it, without any restrictions at all, that becomes a blank endorsement. The check becomes a bearer instrument. In order to negotiate to somebody else, then all you have to do is hand it to them and deliver it. So it converts it from an order instrument to a bearer instrument. A check made out to order that has been endorsed by the payee is a bearer instrument. And for example, Ned mows Lucy's yard. Lucy pays Ned by writing a check made out to the order of Ned for $25. On the way home, Ned sees that Annie has a bicycle for sale that he wants to buy but doesn't have any cash. Ned can endorse the check from Lucy and deliver it to Annie. then Ned has negotiated the check to Annie, and Annie has become the holder. And so to get it negotiated to Ned, there had to be delivery, it had to be handed to him, and then he had to endorse it. But once he's endorsed it with that blank endorsement, he can negotiate it to somebody else, in this case Annie, just by handing it to her, and Annie then becomes the holder. Annie can then present the check at Lucy's bank and demand payment. And so he can negotiate it to a third party just by delivering it after he has that blank endorsement on it. As we've alluded to, if you lose a check with a blank endorsement, anyone who finds it becomes the holder because it's been delivered to them. As soon as they come into possession of it, it's been negotiated to them. Thus, they can cash the check. So that might not be a good situation. However, just because they can cash the check legally, that's not to say that a bank won't be asking questions in that situation. So a bank might kind of turn their nose up at a check like that if you're not the one whose name is on it and it's been endorsed. They'll ask a lot of questions. They might want to see your ID. Banks are pretty cautious about these things, much more than they used to be, actually. But theoretically, at least, they could cash that check, just somebody who finds it, and they won't be legally liable, probably, on that, unless they violate their own depositor agreement with you or something. But as far as Article 3 is concerned, and Article 4, that's perfectly well negotiated. Once it's been blank endorsed, whoever ends up with it is the holder, and they're entitled to payment. Because it's a bearer instrument, and just having it is enough. If the check turns out to be stolen, the original owner of the check can pursue the thief for repayment. But Article 4 lets the bank off the hook because it didn't do anything wrong by honoring such a check. Because it's whoever's in possession of it, that's been negotiated to them, they're the holder. And so you can still go after the thief who actually stole the check in the first place, but you can't go after the bank because they just did what they're supposed to do. They paid the holder, and the holder is the person that has the check. So if you don't want this to happen, be very cautious with the blank endorsement. In the real world, when you attempt to negotiate a check to a third party, like we had in that previous example, where we, would endorse it, and give it to somebody else, that's commonly known as a two-party check. And most stores won't accept those in payment. It's not as common as it used to be since most people don't use paper checks anymore when they go to the grocery store. They use debit cards and that kind of thing. But when I was growing up, there were always signs around, no two-party checks. And I always wondered, what in the world does that mean? But that's what this is talking about. It's when you have a check made out to one person, endorsed by them, and given to another person. That's a two-party check. It's gone through two different hands. And most stores don't want to get into that because, who knows, it may have been forged, it may have been stolen, it just looks kind of suspicious. And so just because it can work doesn't mean that a particular merchant will accept it in payment. Negotiation, though, is extremely common. For example, let's say that you buy a house and sign a promissory note in favor of the Bank of Neosho, which is giving you the loan. But the Bank of Neosho doesn't want to wait 30 years to get all of its money back. Instead, it can sell the right to receive your house payments to another bank for a discount, making a quick buck. To do this, the Bank of Neosho will negotiate the promissory note that you signed to another bank by endorsement and delivery. Before you know it, the note has been negotiated to the Bank of Chicago, and now you have to send your house payments to them. And this happens all the time. If you've never bought a house before, you might think, oh, well, I'll go to my hometown bank and get a loan. Well, that's where the loan will originate. But probably as soon as the ink is halfway dry on the note, they will be selling it to somebody else, negotiating it. And so the stream of payments will go somewhere else. And, as someone who has a mortgage, you'll get, a notice in the mail every 6 months or a year or whatever. Now, this is where you send your checks because we sold your loan. And so that happens a lot. I had a mortgage for, just a few years a while back, and I think I went through 3 different mortgage lenders, where I ended up paying the monthly payments too because they kept negotiating my note around. And so that is very, very common in the banking business. And negotiation happens a lot, not as much with checks as it does with actual notes and things, but I think these examples that I use with checks are very easy to understand. We're familiar with checks. We may not use a promissory note every day, but we know what a check is, so I'll keep using the examples. But just understand, just because the law says you can do something with a check doesn't mean a particular merchant will let you do that. They may have their own policies where they won't accept that, or a bank, or whatever. So there are multiple ways to endorse an instrument. We already saw what a blank endorsement is, where you just sign your name and turn the order instrument into a bearer instrument. A special endorsement is a way of keeping an order instrument even after negotiating it to a third party. Let's look at an example. Charles writes a check to the order of Clara. Clara wants to use the check to pay a debt to Becky. Clara signs her name on the back of the check, but also writes, "Pay to Becky," and then hands the check to Becky. That is a special endorsement. Clara has negotiated the check to Becky. Becky can then endorse a check and demand payment from Charles's bank. And so Clara, if she just signed her name, that would have been a blank endorsement, would have turned it into a bearer instrument. However, she didn't do that. She signed it and said, "Pay to Becky." That's a special endorsement. It keeps it an order instrument. It just changes to the order of whom. In this case, it's Becky. And so she's changed the person who ends up getting the check negotiated to them after delivery. So this is a way we can keep an order instrument and just change who is actually getting paid. A special endorsement solves the problem of someone finding a lost check becoming a holder just by virtue of finding it and enforcing payment. And so we can control who has it. If Clara had lost that check and it just said "Pay to Becky," well, anyone who's not Becky can't go up to the bank teller window and say, "Please pay me," because they're not Becky. They'd have to prove that they're Becky. And so that solves that problem that we have with blank endorsements of losing the check. With an order instrument, of course, negotiation requires delivery and endorsement. So we have to do the endorsement part. If you find an order instrument with a special endorsement, find it laying on the sidewalk or something, unlike a blank endorsement, you don't become the holder and you can't take it to the bank and cash it. So it is much safer if we're going to do that rather than just sign a check and hand it to somebody and hope it ends up in the right place. That would solve that problem. Another type of endorsement is what we call a restrictive endorsement. And so that restricts what can be done with the instrument after it has been endorsed. And the most common one that you see is that somebody will write, sign their name on the back to endorse the check and then write "for deposit only." And that keeps the bank from cashing the check for someone else if you lose it. Now, all that can be done with the check at that point is to deposit it into the payee's bank account. And so it'll keep the bank from just cashing the check should someone find it. The only thing they can really do with the check is deposit it into your account. And so again, that keeps that problem from someone finding a check with a blank endorsement from just finding it and then being able to cash it. Let's talk now about liability, defenses, and holders in due course. This is really kind of getting to the heart of the negotiable instruments material and kind of what makes it special, I guess. A negotiable instrument creates certain legal liabilities. Of course, whoever is making the instrument is promising to pay a certain amount of money, so they're going to be liable for paying that amount of money. If they were trying to back out, they'd be in breach of contract, and there'd be some other things you could do to them. So they are creating that liability for themselves when they make the instrument. If the maker refuses to pay on the instrument, the holder of the instrument can sue to get their money. For example, if Judy buys a car from Charlie with a check for $5,000 and Charlie tries to cash the check, but it bounces, which just means that Judy's checking account doesn't have that much money in it. And the technical term for this is that the bank dishonors it, which means they refuse to pay it. Then Charlie can sue Judy for the $5,000 she still owes him. And so you can sue the maker if, in fact, the instrument ends up not resulting in you getting your money. What's a little more surprising on negotiable instruments is that the endorser also subjects himself to liability on the instrument. Not just the maker, but also the endorser. Let's look at an example here. Scott writes a check for $100 to buy a garden tiller from Frank. Frank happens to owe Rick $100 for work Rick did landscaping Frank's yard. Frank endorses Scott's check over to Rick, and so does that special endorsement saying "pay to Rick." Rick tries to cash the check, but the bank dishonors it. Rick can now sue Scott, who is liable because he made the instrument. So that's the maker. He wrote a check for $100. He doesn't have $100 in the bank. He's liable. Slam dunk, easy case. However, this is a kind of surprising part. Rick could also sue Frank, who endorsed the instrument. And by endorsing it, you also become liable on the instrument. And in this case, it makes kind of logical sense because Frank gave Rick a worthless piece of paper in payment. And so he still owes Rick $100. And so Rick can choose whom he would rather sue. Do I want to sue Frank, who gave me this check that was endorsed over to me, or do I want to sue the maker who made the check in the first place? And so you can sue either one. So an endorser becomes liable on the instrument when it is negotiated to a third party. So if you endorse a check over to somebody and it ends up bouncing, that may not be your fault, but you still owe the person that you gave the check to that amount of money. And so you're liable to them as well. So it kind of makes sense when you think about it. That's a little surprising, I think, to figure that out for the first time. So as an endorser, that might kind of give you a little bit of pause there. Oh goodness, I don't know if this check is going to bounce or not, but I'm giving it to a third person, with my special endorsement. So, am I going to get sued if this, guy who gave me the check in the first place is a loser and doesn't have that much money in the bank? Well, an endorser can avoid liability by using a type of endorsement we have not yet talked about that's called a qualified endorsement. So, for instance, in this example, if Frank had endorsed the check from Scott, and then written pay to Rick without recourse, and that without recourse is special language there, which means that Frank is refusing to subject himself to liability on the instrument, and then Rick cannot sue him on the instrument in that case. And so basically he's saying, I have no idea, if the guy who gave me this check has enough money in the bank, and so I don't want to be on the hook, because of this check. And so that will mean that he isn't going to be liable on that. Now, a couple of things going on here. First, if Rick were smart, he wouldn't be very confident that he would actually see the money if he's accepting a two-party check with a qualified endorsement. That's basically a vote of no confidence from the guy who's giving you the check. Frank is saying, I don't know if there's enough money in the bank to cover this or not. Here it is for whatever it's worth, okay? So, again, just because something can legally be done doesn't mean it's a good idea. So Rick might say, I don't know, I'd rather have cash, and insist upon a different method of payment. Another thing is that even though Frank isn't going to be liable on the instrument as a holder if he does this, Rick could still sue him for breach of contract. And so, he still owes that money to Rick, and if the check ended up bouncing, he wouldn't have paid that money that he owes. And so it's not like he completely gets off the hook here. But anyway, that is one way of shielding himself from liability on the check itself as a holder. He can have that qualified endorsement. We've already seen what a holder is. And on a bearer instrument, we know that a holder is anyone who possesses it. If it's been delivered to you, however that occurred, and you're in possession of it, you're the holder. Simple enough. With an order instrument, a holder must both have possession and have the instrument endorsed over to him. The holder is the person who has the power to demand payment on the instrument. And so it's good to be a holder. If the payment isn't made like it's supposed to be, the holder has the power to sue to enforce the instrument. However, the maker of the instrument, the person who originated it, may have certain defenses that he can use against a holder who is suing to enforce the note. Let's look at an example here. Freddie buys a tractor on credit from John Deere, and I'm sorry to mention John Deere after putting you through that discussion question a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, Freddie makes a note promising to make payments on the tractor to John Deere. John Deere then negotiates the note to the Bank of Atlanta. However, Freddie discovers that the tractor is defective, which is a breach of the warranty that John Deere gave him. Freddie stops paying on the note. The Bank of Atlanta, which is the holder of the instrument, sues Freddie. However, even though the bank is a holder, Freddie can raise a defense of breach of warranty against the bank. And so any defense that Freddie would have had against the maker, he can also use against the holder. So in this case, he has a viable defense against John Deere, so he can also use that defense against the holder. Remember, the reason this works, negotiation is based on contract principles. And when the contract right is assigned away, the assignee gets no more rights than the original party had. So here, because Freddie could have raised his defense against John Deere, he can also raise it against the Bank of Atlanta because they just stepped into the shoes of John Deere, basically. So holders are vulnerable if the maker of the instrument has a defense. But here is where it gets pretty interesting. Now remember that one of the goals of negotiable instruments is to create a substitute for money. Which means that something that can change hands easily and be widely accepted as a means of payment. In accounting terms, if you've had accounting, they talk about liquidity. When cash is the most liquid of all assets, it can change hands, 100 times a day, and people will accept it as payment. It's easy to spend and it's easy to earn, and it can change hands very, very easily. Well, our goal for these payment substitutes, money substitutes like negotiable instruments, is we want them to be able to change hands and be almost as liquid as cash and be able to be transferred around. Well, people would be very reluctant to accept instruments as payment if they were worried about the fact that there might be a defense out there that would keep them from getting paid. That poor Bank of Atlanta, it had no idea there was a defective tractor. It didn't get to inspect the tractor before it was sold, or, doesn't know anything about tractors. It just got this note negotiated to it, okay? And so, would a bank like that be, as willing to accept negotiable instruments and payment, if there are all these strings attached potentially, all these defenses sitting out there. And so we want to eliminate some of that problem in order to make negotiable instruments as liquid as possible, as much like cash as we can make them. So the law recognizes this problem and deals with it by letting holders who meet certain special qualifications take an instrument free of any defenses that might be out there. And so in this case, if the Bank of Atlanta meets these requirements, these defenses that would work against John Deere wouldn't work against it, even though it stepped into the shoes of John Deere. And so we will try to make it as liquid as possible by eliminating, the bank from having to worry about some of these defenses. Well, the special type of holder who meets these requirements is what we call a holder in due course. And that person gets more rights than the person who negotiated the instrument to them. And this is where that traditional rule of the assignee stepping into the assignor's shoes is just turned on its head. Here, the holder in due course gets more rights than the person he gets the instrument from. And that is so counterintuitive to us, to be able to get more rights than the person you got something from. How does that work? Well, here's an example just to show you how it does work. Calvin buys a lawnmower from Carterville Implement Company on credit. Calvin signs a note, which Carterville Implement then negotiates to the Bank of Springfield. The bank is a holder in due course. Calvin discovers the lawnmower is defective and stops paying on the note. The bank demands payment. Since the bank is a holder in due course, Calvin cannot use his defense against the bank. It will only work against Carterville Implement. Calvin must pay the bank, but can then sue Carterville Implement for the breach of warranty. And so the holder in due course here is protected. Even though there was a defective lawnmower, of course, they probably knew nothing about that. The poor Bank of Springfield has no idea it was a bad lawnmower, but this defense, is out there. But they don't have to worry about it because they're a holder in due course. And so Calvin still has to pay the bank, even though he ended up with a lemon lawnmower. Now, he's not without options. He can go sue Carterville Equipment for selling him a crappy lawnmower. And so he's not without remedy here. But he still has to pay the bank who became the holder in due course. We'll protect them. And so that allows them to be able to, have this note changing hands here without worrying about these defenses. And so we see kind of why that is in order to make a note as much of a cash substitute as we can. But it still is kind of counterintuitive that the bank would have more rights, than they would have, than the person they got the note from would have had. So again, this is completely counterintuitive. The bank got better rights than the implement company that gave them the note, even though they stepped into the implement company's shoes. So kind of a weird deal. Since it qualifies as a holder in due course, the bank here gets more protection than the implement company does. And, if it helps you to understand this principle, we looked at the buyer in the ordinary course of business a few chapters ago, and this really isn't all that different. Remember, the buyer in the ordinary course of business could take free, of claims and stuff, so they'd get to keep, the TV that they got from a business or whatever, even though it, had been bought with a hot check and that kind of thing. Same kind of deal. Where somebody down the line who ends up, with this note ends up with more rights than the person they got it from. But it's a lot like voidable title, but still it's really, really strange. And so it makes law students kind of get their eyes crossed a little bit. So, but it is a little bit different. So then what turns an ordinary holder into this special category, the holder in due course? Article 3, which governs negotiable instruments, explains that a holder in due course must first be a holder of the instrument, so an ordinary holder, and then meet the additional requirements that we're going to look at here. First, the holder must take the instrument for value. It can't just be a present, they have to, be paying for it, giving something in exchange for it, the value. It has to be done in good faith. It can't be some kind of shady deal to where they're trying to put one over on somebody. They can have no notice that the instrument is overdue or has been dishonored. So, if it's a bad check, for instance, they don't know that. If there's not enough money in the bank account, they don't know that. They just assume that everything's on the up and up, and they have no reason to think otherwise. Fourth, they have no notice that the instrument has a forged signature or has been altered. So, if somebody stole someone else's checkbook and started forging signatures, we don't know that. We don't know that it's been altered. If they put an extra zero on the check, we don't know that. So again, kind of that good faith thing going through here. And they have no notice of any defenses to payment. So in that last example we looked at, if the Bank of Springfield had known it was a crappy lawnmower when they got the note, they're not a holder in due course. But if they have no notice that there's any defenses out there to payment when they get the note, then we're okay. And then they can become that holder in due course. Again, this concept is a little bit funny, but it's very similar to what we studied in regular contracts with the idea of a good faith purchaser for value. That idea of voidable title and all of that, where the good faith purchaser for value can take title to property free and clear of defenses, basically, that could be raised against somebody else. If they were just an innocent purchaser, who ended up with this property, had no reason to suspect anything fishy was going on. And we saw some examples of that when we studied those issues. And likewise, to be a holder in due course, you have to pay value for it. It can't be a gift or some shady deal. You have to pay a fair price, and it must be done in good faith, meaning it's an honest transaction. We will, kind of look into the heart of the person here, and just to make sure that, everything's on the up and up. It's what we call an arm's length transaction that, is just a normal course of business. Nobody's doing anything dishonest or shady here, at least on the part of the good faith purchaser, and they actually do have good faith, and we have to make sure of that. The holder must not be aware of any problems with the instrument. No red flags. We looked at situations like where somebody would be looking at buying, let's say, a TV, and it was like new condition, but somebody's trying to sell it at half price, and they have to sell it today, and they'll only take cash. And there's some red flags that make us wonder: is this thing stolen? What's going on with this? Well, a holder must not have any of these red flags in order to become a holder in due course. There shouldn't be any reason for them to suspect that something is wrong. And so if they just honestly accept this note, it's negotiated to them, and they don't have any of these red flags, and they might become a holder in due course. If the holder meets these requirements, they can become a holder in due course and take the instrument free of most defenses. There are still some defenses that will work against a holder in due course, but they are very limited. It is much, much better to be a holder in due course than just a regular old holder. Because the holder is subject to all kinds of defenses that would work against the maker. The holder in due course is shielded from most of them. There are some, though, like for instance, if someone forges your name on an instrument, forgery is a defense against everyone, even holders in due course. And there are some other examples of that too, which we won't go into because it's a little too detailed for our little sojourn through the world of negotiable instruments here. But just keep in mind, it is much, much, much better to be a holder in due course than a regular holder because you will take free of all these defenses, almost all of them. And so you're in pretty good shape if you're a holder in due course. Let's talk now about checks and fund transfers, a little bit different than just a regular old note. Articles 3 and 4 have some special rules dealing with negotiable instruments as they relate to banks. And we've seen that a check is a special type of draft. And it's an order for a bank to pay some of the maker's money on deposit to the payee of the check. And so when you're talking about a check, the person writing the check is the drawer and the bank is the drawee. And then, of course, whoever ends up with the money is the payee. So there are some special rules that apply when you're dealing with banks, specifically with checks that are dealt with, especially in Article 4. The assumption is that if you write a check, that you have the money in the bank to cover the amount for which the check is written. If you knowingly don't and you write a bad check, then you've committed a crime, and passing bad checks is a crime because basically you're stealing. You're giving people a worthless piece of paper and leaving the grocery store with their goods or whatever the case might be. So there are criminal issues that go on with that also. But of course, we're worried about the civil stuff now and dealing with Articles 3 and 4 of the UCC. But you're making a guarantee that you have the money in the bank when you write a check. But your bank, the drawee, usually makes no guarantees that you have enough money to cover the check. And so the bank's not on the hook just because you write a check on your account with that bank. What happens is the payee will present the check to the bank for payment. And at that time, the bank has to make a choice. They can either honor the check and cash it, or it can dishonor the check and refuse to pay it if it looks at your account and sees there's not enough money in there to cover it. And so the bank either honors it by paying the check or dishonors it by refusing to pay the check. A bank, though, can go beyond this normal situation and actually guarantee that your check will be paid. And sometimes that's desirable because some people are reluctant to take a check in payment, but if the bank signs on and says, yes, we guarantee that this depositor has enough money in our bank to cover the check, then a person's much more likely to accept a check in payment. So the bank can take the check that you write and certify it. And certifying means that they're guaranteeing that you have enough money in the bank to pay that check. Essentially, they're signing the bank's name to the checks too. So it's not just you guaranteeing payment on this check, it's also the bank. And so the bank usually is seen as pretty trustworthy, and so that really makes people much more likely to accept your check in payment. When the bank does this, that will make the bank liable if an endorser, or like an endorser rather, if the check bounces. And so if the check were to bounce after the bank has guaranteed it, certified it, then the person who gets stiffed could sue you and could sue the bank, just like you can sue an endorser if the check bounces. This is called a certified check. And as we've noted, they make the payee much more secure, believing that the check's not going to bounce. If the bank signs off on it, they know the bank, not only is your full faith and credit behind this check, but so is the bank's. And the bank ought to have enough assets to cover this check. A money order is kind of similar. It's a draft where the same bank is both the drawer and the drawee. And again, this is much more trustworthy than just a garden variety check. And what a money order is, it's the bank promising to pay the payee some of the bank's money. And so people who won't take checks will take money orders because, again, the bank is the one who is making the promise that we're going to pay money. And so when you get a money order, you go give some money to the bank, and the bank is the one that drafts the money order and says, we, the bank, guarantee to pay X amount of money. And banks rarely write hot checks, as you might imagine, and so people will accept money orders even if they won't accept checks. Likewise, a cashier's check is a check on which a bank is both drawer and drawee. And so, again, people who won't take personal checks will take a cashier's check because that is a check written on the bank. So it doesn't clear through your account, it clears through the bank's account. And so if you go to the bank and ask for a cashier's check, they'll take money out of your account, put it in the bank's account, and then write a check on the bank's account is basically what's going on. So again, people are much more likely to trust a bank than you. And so if the bank says they're going to be good on their check, then pretty much we can be sure that they are, and people will accept a cashier's check as payment even if they won't accept a personal check. When a payee takes a check to a bank and tries to cash it, that's what we call a presentment. They are presenting the check to the bank. Commonly, what happens is the drawer will write a check and give it to the payee. The payee will then take it to his bank, which is probably, could be a different bank from the drawer's bank, and in order to cash or deposit the check. So the payee's bank will then take the check and then send that check to the drawee's bank for payment. For example, Ted writes a check to Norma, with the drawee being Ted's bank, the Bank of Miami. Norma endorses the check and deposits it into her bank at the Bank of Grove. The Bank of Grove then sends the check through the banking system to the Bank of Miami for payment. And so sometimes the drawee, or the drawer and the payee will have the same bank, but it doesn't always happen that way, certainly. And so the banks will have to send checks to each other in order for the money to change hands and get where it needs to go. When the check is presented to the drawee bank, the bank has a decision to make. It can either pay the check or dishonor the check. And so it will have to look at the account the check is drawn on and figure out if there's enough money in there. Or it may be suspicious of the check for some other reason, thinking it's a forgery or something like that, and may want to dishonor it for that reason. According to Article 4 of the UCC, the bank has until midnight on the banking day after it received the check in order to decide whether or not to honor it. And if it's going to decide to dishonor the check, it has to send notice of dishonor back to wherever it got the check from. And so if you present the check to the bank on Monday afternoon, it has until midnight on Tuesday night to figure out what to do about it, basically. But it has to make a decision, is it going to honor it or dishonor it? Sometimes a bank will honor a check even if its customer doesn't have enough money in his account to cover the check. And so technically your check has bounced. And so you may have messed up, balancing your checkbook or something, and you're a few dollars off. And so you empty your account without realizing it. And sometimes the bank will be nice and go ahead and honor the check anyway. When that happens, that's called an overdraft, and that's treated like a loan from the bank to the customer. The customer is obligated to pay the bank back for honoring the overdrawn check. And usually, for performing this service, the bank will charge you a hefty little fee for an overdrawn check. And so that's where they make a lot of their money, actually, is by covering things like this. So there will be some kind of service charge that'll show up on your account statement the next time you get one from the bank. So a bank may not automatically dishonor a check, even if it could, depending upon their customer relationship, their customer agreement, what the customer has agreed to do, because the customer will have to sign up for that service, basically, if the bank is going to do that. Also, checks have a lifespan of 6 months. After 6 months, after a check has been written, the check becomes stale, is what we say about it. So if you do have a check, if someone writes you a check, you need to do something about it within 6 months before it becomes stale. When a bank is presented with a stale check, it is under no legal obligation to honor it. It still could, but it doesn't have to, unless it's a certified check. But if it's just a regular garden variety check, if it's stale, the bank doesn't have to honor it. And so, like I said, if you have a check, don't leave it in your wallet for more than 6 months. And you need to take care of that, or it could be stale. The bank could dishonor it. Sometimes you might write a check and then something bad happens. For example, the check might get lost, or you might find out that the person you were trying to pay with the check scammed you. They cheated you. They sold you a painting at their garage sale that they swore was a Monet, and then you take it to Antiques Roadshow and find out some guy named Bob painted it, and it wasn't Ross. So anyway, whatever happens, you may end up needing to basically stop payment on the check. And you can give your bank a stop payment order, telling them, okay, there's this check out in the world that I wrote, but I want you to dishonor it when it comes up for payment. So this instructs the bank to dishonor your check, even if you have enough money in your account. If that check is presented to the bank, they're supposed to dishonor it for various reasons, whatever might have come up. If the bank ignores your order and goes ahead and pays the check after the stop payment order, the bank will be liable to you and have to put the money back in your account out of the bank's own pocket. And so if they ignore your stop payment order that you put in with them, and they go ahead and pay this check, then they're going to have to cover it themselves out of pocket, and it won't come out of your account. A bank can also be liable if it wrongly dishonors a check. That would happen if the bank is presented with a perfectly good check, and there is money in your account to cover it, but the bank, for whatever reason, decides to dishonor your check anyway. And if that happens, the bank has probably violated its contract with you, because you sign an agreement when you open a bank account, and they agree to do their job, and you agree to be a good customer. And so probably there's a breach of contract there if there's no good reason for them to dishonor the check. It might be different if they have reason to believe it's forged or it's not your signature on the check or something like that. But if for whatever reason they just blatantly decide not to honor a check that you've written, and you have enough money in your account and that gets you in a mess, then they could be liable to you for breach of contract for that. A bank is responsible for making sure that the signature on your checks is actually your signature. So if someone steals your checkbook and writes checks by forging your signature, the bank will be liable to you if it deducts money from your account to pay those checks. It's supposed to be able to tell if it's your signature or not. The law will presume that the bank will check the signature on your checks to make sure it is your signature. And in the olden days, I think they used signature cards and things like that that the customer had signed. Nowadays, software does that. In fact, I had a friend whose father was writing software that was designed for when these checks were scanned in at the bank, that the software would go check the signature card and compare the two, and it would red flag ones that didn't look like that they matched. And so anyway, the bank is responsible for trying to make sure it's not a forged check. If the bank pays on a forged check, the bank will be out the money because it will have to replace the money in your account. Having said that, it's always really good practice to tell your bank if you end up having checks stolen. You should be trying to get that, stop payment on those checks and tell your bank as soon as possible. That will help you tremendously. Anyway, likewise, the bank is liable if someone takes your check for $500 and alters it, puts another zero on it, turns it into $5,000, something like that. A bank is supposed to notice those alterations and kind of take a look at the check and not honor it if it's been altered in that way. So the bank is charged with making sure the check is in good form and will be liable to you for the difference if it cashes an altered check. So in that case, the 500 to 5,000, if the bank goes ahead and cashes that, they'll be, they'll be on the hook to you for, the difference between the 5,000 and the $500. And so a bank has a duty to make sure that the checks that they are honoring haven't been altered or forged or something like that. Well, paper checks may be on the way out. I certainly don't use that many. In my personal life, we pay our electric bill and things like that with a check, but lots of people just have that deducted from their account and things like that. We use electronic payments rather than paper checks a lot of times. And so when we do those sorts of things, using computer networks to move money around, that's called an electronic fund transfer, or EFT. And that can happen in a number of ways. For instance, if you hook up your bank account to PayPal, and then you go, buying things on eBay. Well, every payment you make on the internet debits your bank account through an EFT. There's certainly no paper check involved, but when you make a payment through PayPal, PayPal will say, "Hey, bank, we need some money out of this guy's account," and so then the money gets moved electronically without ever being on any kind of paper negotiable instrument of any kind. These days, if you go to Walmart and pay with a check, they actually will, what happens is it's not really a check transaction. What they do is they'll scan the check through their computer and then give the check back to you. And rather than actually present the paper check to the bank for payment, Walmart will use the numbers on your check, your account number and the routing number and all that stuff, to generate an EFT and will actually debit your bank electronically. And so Walmart does not have to wait days for a check to clear and handle all that paper and all that kind of stuff. Before you leave the store, they have debited your account for that amount. And so that's just an electronic transaction. They zap your account right then and there. And so you can't write a check to Walmart and expect it to float around out there for a couple of days. People used to do that all the time. You knew the check would take a couple of days to clear, and so you could write a check for more than you had in your account, knowing you're going to get paid the next day or something. Well, you can't do that anymore because they will zap your account right away. And so an EFT is a special kind of transaction that's governed by a special article of the UCC, Article 4A. 4 deals with checks and things of that nature. 4A and deals with these electronic fund transfer situations. So there are some special rules and special terminology that deals with that. The basic principles are very similar to the rules governing checks, and so we're not going to go into enormous amounts of detail about that, but certainly it's a brave new world out there. How long paper checks will actually hang around is anyone's guess, but certainly their role has diminished somewhat as people use their bank cards, their ATM cards and debit cards and things like that. The need for checks has kind of disappeared. That doesn't stop me from getting in line behind the old lady at Walmart every time who wants to write a check, even though she could just hand it to the cashier and let the cashier zap it and turn it into an EFT, but they still always want to fill out all those little boxes. But anyway, certainly the world is changing, and probably the law will continue to evolve and to deal with those situations as we develop new payment systems all the time to make things a little bit easier as we're buying and selling stuff. So, in conclusion, there you have it. Negotiable instruments in a nutshell. And we just kind of dipped our toe in the water just to show you kind of how this world works. And the rules are actually very detailed. They can get pretty complicated. I certainly haven't told you everything there is to know about the subject. I've just been trying to introduce you to the topic because it is kind of important. If you're taking checks in payment or paying with checks or whatever, or ever take out a loan and sign a promissory note, get a mortgage or any of that stuff, you will deal with this subject at least in a little bit. So my goal has just kind of been to introduce you to this and make you a little conversant in the terminology and kind of understand what's going on. So I hope I succeeded in that. But either way, I will see you one more time next week.